First of all, I want to thank everybody for having me. Thank you, Steve, for the nice introduction. And I also want to thank all of you guys for being so brave. I do not think that there is a single chance that even though I was always a very good communicator, I would have ever signed up to be a competitor where I wasn't going to be able to rely on slides. And so in that vein, I have attempted to step relatively far away from how I normally present, which would be with lots of slides, lots of data-rich sort of graphs that I could rely on to help me bridge through, and I've attempted to embody the 3-minute thesis and go off of memory or just off of vibes. So again, thank you guys for being so brave. It enabled me to sort of step outside my comfort zone a little bit. And I wish I could tell you that that the hardest part of science will always be the experiments, but of course you guys know now that the much harder part of science is actually communicating your science, whether it's writing papers or grants, or doing your presentations in your departments, where you see sort of the nerves that people get, and you also have to think on your feet, and you don't get to rely on on slides. So experiments will always fail, and they will continue to fail. And what I have found out is that the failed experiments are much easier to troubleshoot than the challenges of communication that you'll continuously face throughout your career. If you stay at the bench and your science and the experiments remain your largest problem, that's a great career path too, and it'll be a simpler career path, I think. Because as soon as you start working with larger groups of people, as soon as you start trying to solve complex problems with other people, you find that there's a lot more reliance upon your soft skills that are not whether you can pipette or whether you can calculate things well or whether your chemistry is really, really great. So I also wish I can tell you guys that the imposter syndrome or the nerves go away, and they don't. You will always feel like you're actually not the appropriate person, or you're not actually capable to do whatever that next step is. And as Steve said, my career at Convello, I came in at a director level. My job was sort of to set up a lab and recruit people in, and then build a team. And that felt very comfortable. I had run a lot of labs, I had done a lot of science. But very quickly I became somebody who was managing contracts with large pharma, managing programs with large pharma, recruiting people in and managing people, which is also something that you never ever get taught really in grad school. And so again, I want to sort of applaud all of you guys for already stepping outside of the bench and encouraging yourselves to grow in an area that most of us are not educated in through our actual education. And grad school is, maybe 80,000 years long, or at least that's how it felt for me. And then maybe you do a postdoc, and that's another 4 years. So 80,000 in 4 years, and you leave with, an intense education in your field, or maybe two fields if you sort of stepped outside of your normal, your original scientific expertise. But that still is almost certainly only going to be a couple intense areas of scientific focus. And then you have to decide what you want to be when you grow up. And again, if you stay at the bench, maybe you will have to limit your requirement and your reliance on your extra communication skills. But it's very likely that that's not going to happen. Particularly if you are an excellent scientist. What ends up happening is that you're good at the bench, you're good at coming up with ideas, you execute your experiments well, and they shove you into managing other people. And none of us were trained to do that. And so I think what I want to talk to you guys a little bit about is sort of how I've progressed through my career and the things that I've learned, because most of what I use on a daily basis is not things that I learned at Case, at Akron, in my formal education. It's what you pick up along the way. And I think you guys, again, have already taken a huge step that I certainly hadn't taken at your stage of your career, to embrace this idea of being able to communicate and to connect with people and to distill your ideas down to a digestible 3 minutes. And again, I think that this is a relatively contrived scenario, right? One slide, 3 minutes is intense and insane, and probably not something that you'll ever have to do again. But I think that compression forces you to find clarity, and I think that was really impressive and obvious to those of us that were judging, that you guys had thought intensely about what your project was. You had thought about why other people should care about it, not just the people who are on your committee, not just the people who are in your lab, and maybe not just your friends and family who sort of inherently care about the things that you care about. So again, as Steve said, my role at Convello has started 8 years ago, and Convello Therapy. Oh, I'm in charge of this, not somebody else, so I can move this on. So Convello Therapeutics is a small molecule drug discovery company. Again, it launched out of Case Western almost a decade ago now. It sat in stealth mode, which just basically means that nobody really externally knew that it existed. And I was the third employee that was recruited in. I came from the Harrington Discovery Institute, which is again not a Case institution, but a sort of a sister institution to Case under university hospitals. And there I had learned the nuts and bolts of doing drug discovery. And so then I was brought in at an early stage at Convello into a team of, I don't know, maybe 6 or 7 people. I was the third full-time employee, and there were some advisors around. And essentially none of us knew what we were doing. And so the relationships, this is going to be recorded, right, and presented. We all knew exactly what we were doing, and it was always focused on this. Now, most of us had no idea what we were doing. We were learning on the go. We were relying very heavily upon each other. And so the skills that were the soft skills were also incredibly important for the success of Convello, because you can't afford to have turnover. You can't afford to fight over things that don't matter. And so you have to really rely on your ability to build relationships, communicate problems scientifically or otherwise, interpersonal, resolve them. And these are incredibly important communication areas that are also quite distinctive from what you guys just did, which was more like oration or public speaking. And so the other challenge, I think, for talking about how important communication is what areas would I focus on? Is it the idea that you need to be able to be persuasive and pleasant, and that people, you're not going to make someone want to stand up and just walk away from you? Of course that matters. Is it that you have to appear to be intelligent enough to be speaking about that topic? Of course that matters. But there's also so many other areas on an every single day basis that will impact your career substantially. And so I want to just continue to remind you that you can be the best scientist, maybe even the most brilliant scientist. And if nobody wants to talk to you, if nobody wants to work with you, if nobody can understand what you're thinking or saying or doing, then it doesn't matter. And so I want to give you just a few examples within Convello of how my career has progressed and how I've had to learn to communicate to different stakeholders within the environment of biotech. So again, I came in as a director level, and I built a lab. So I had to bring a bunch of people in, I had to hire them, and I had to identify whether I thought they would be a good culture fit, whether they would work well together, whether they had the skills necessary. Another challenge in biotech is that you don't have a ton of time or money to train people, so you have to just hope that they have the skills that they say they have, and then you bring them in. And it's very different from academia, where there's a huge network of people that you can kind of offload your new graduate student to learn a new skill, or even if they're a postdoc or a new hire and they don't have exactly what you need, you can kind of send them to the lab next door to learn a skill. In biotech, that's not really possible, and you don't have the money or the time to do that. And so there was a huge component of my early part of my career of being able to read somebody. Were they lying? Were they serious about their resume? We did get a number of falsified resumes, and not everybody has that inherent innate talent to kind of read somebody. But I think you can build that skill, and so that's another thing I wanted to to sort of remind you, is that just as much as you practice to orate up here, to speak with no slides, you can also practice reading people. You can open your senses up and really look at somebody and listen deeply, and you will build an understanding and an awareness of what they are thinking, whether they're telling you the truth. Are they open? Are they honest? Are they vulnerable? And will that, wherever they sit on the spectrum of those various things and their skill set, will they fit within your company or within your team? And if you can be the person who can read that, you can really be an asset to your company or to your lab. Even if you're running a lab, you can say, that person's really great, obviously very smart, never going to work here for whatever reason. And that doesn't mean there's anything wrong with them. It just means this isn't the right space for them. And the earlier you can ascertain that, and the kinder you can be while determining that, the better you'll be at building teams. And it's something that I feel like I have always excelled at, been able to say, this person's great but not great for here, or this person's great but they absolutely cannot report to person be? Everything else is great, they can't be this can't happen. And there's been a few times in my career where I've been overruled, where someone has said, yeah, I agree, I see what you're seeing, but I don't think it matters. And then of course there's been huge problems later, and then you're trying to figure out how to communicate between people who don't get along or don't like each other or don't have the same communication strategies or skill set. So if you are in the position to hone those skills, I really encourage you do so. And do it through a wide variety of people, not just your friends, but you can practice there too, but also their family. Who are these people? Where did they come from? What's their mom, their dad like? What are their brothers and sisters like? How did that influence my friend and their behavior? And you can start to sort of understand and I don't mean to be cynical, but you can kind of start to see archetypes of people, and it'll really help you in your methods of how to communicate to that type of person. So that was the first part of my career, was sort of building this lab, or at Convello at least, was building a lab, building this team, and building a pharmacology engine. So we needed to be able to make thousands of compounds every year and screen them through assays and decide which ones moved forward or not. And that was the easy part. The hard part was who can do it, who can handle the grind on a day-to-day basis. How do I communicate to these people how important their role is so that they don't feel like a factory worker? Particularly because I couldn't hire factory workers to do it. I needed to hire PhD level or comparable educated and skilled individuals. And so that communication laterally or down, I would say, was also really important. Could I describe their role within the company? Could I back it up and say, we are trying to discover a drug that can reverse disability progression in multiple sclerosis patients? Can I teach you that multiple sclerosis hits women predominantly, but also men in their childbearing or child rearing ages? Can I remind you that that is why we are doing this? This is why I'm handing you another stack of 40 compounds to run again this week. And if you can do that, what you'll find in an honest and clear and sort of transparent way of, I don't expect you to find this to be the most stimulating week of your life, but if you could run this again, maybe we'll get a little bit closer to bringing a patient to, a therapy to a patient that could really help them. And if you can do that, if you can find sort of honest ways of communicating difficult or unpleasant ideas, what you'll find is that you'll get honesty, vulnerability, and clear and open communication back. And so again, I found in my career that I was able to retain really, really talented people that should have probably left, moved on to their next career, used my company as a stepping stone, and instead they stayed because they felt respected, they felt like they were part of the process, and they got to see why we were doing it regularly. As I continued to progress in my career, I also then started having to manage external collaborations or partnerships with large pharma companies. And this was a completely different type of communication. So this was lateral, where everybody was also, a highly trained scientist, but we were trying to bridge two different companies and build a huge team. And I needed to continue to make sure that they felt that we were valuable and that they didn't walk away from us, because we didn't have the money to pay for this ourselves. We needed them to fund it, and so we had to appear valuable. And I genuinely believe that we were valuable, but you never wanted to let them forget it. And so how did I continue to think about what were they needing to hear from us to feel that we were valuable and that this was a good investment in of their money. In addition, as I continued to progress in my role, I started to interact more with our board members and our investors. And so this is, again, another layer of communication where you are almost certainly not talking to somebody who can go toe-to-toe with you on the science. You have to be able to recognize who this person is, what is their background, maybe do a little bit of, or a lot of research in advance of who's going to be at the room, what do they look like, what are their background, what other companies have they invested in, what do they like or not like, does anybody in their family have MS? Like, you need to kind of know some of these things. That way you can then distill your research down to only the necessary details that they care about. If you spend a ton of time talking about how oligodendrocytes can be pushed into this type of cell, and this person is maybe a very successful business person, but they ran a construction company and they built skyscrapers in New York City, are they going to be able to follow along? They're going to start losing the importance of what you're doing. And if you make people bored, or if you make them feel dumb because you talk so far above their understanding level, then they're not going to want to keep talking to you. And so in biotech, making sure that people want to keep talking to you, that they understand what you're doing and they think that it's valuable, is really the key to actually getting your work funded and to continue to develop your drug to the clinic. So again, I believe that MS patients deserve something beyond just immunosuppression. I was excited to see a bunch of you guys presenting on immunology, because I have an immunology background, but there are lots of really good immunology drugs, immunosuppressing drugs that help people with MS, and yet patients still have disability progression. And so if I can bring this to somebody who maybe builds skyscrapers and say, you would not want your wife or your daughter or your children or yourself to lose the ability to walk or see in their 50s. And right now, even with strong immunosuppression, MS patients still might lose their ability to walk, to think, to see in their 50s, and that's far too young. And so what I want to do with my drug is to give them the chance to regenerate their myelin, protect their axons, and recapture that ability. And if you can bring someone a package like that, it's much harder for them to say, no, I don't think that's worth my investment. Okay, I'm going to move on. So again, I told you guys that I feel strongly that our academic education, especially at Case, is wonderful, and yet I think that as you launch into your career, you will find, and I certainly have found, that there's big areas missing. And I love that this competition exists, because I think it's trying to fill a gap. But what I left from my education feeling like I was not educated on how to speak to my peers that weren't scientifically in the same space, or to communicate down. I was always educated in how to communicate to people who were extremely intelligent and their expertise was within my space, like my mentor, my thesis advisors, maybe scientific conferences where you're presenting and you can just be so smart and you can use all the jargon, and it really maybe almost makes you feel smarter to do so. But in reality, almost always in my job, I'm talking to somebody who cares about drug development or multiple sclerosis, but they have no ability to hold the same level of scientific conversation as I could. So I think it's incredibly important to think about where you can continue to practice these skills. For me, I was the first person in my family to go to college, graduate from college, certainly the first person to even think about grad school. So all through my graduate career, whenever I'd call my moms, when I'd call my grandpa, my dad, I was able to talk to them about my science, but I had to learn how to bring it to their level, because I was sort of speeding down the highway away from any sort of educational footprint that they had. I couldn't talk to them about antigen presenting cells or dendritic cells. I had to reframe everything. And so all of the sort of analogies that you guys used were things that I did too. My grandpa was a huge war buff. He loved reading about history and war, and I couldn't care less at the time. The unfortunate truth is that as you get older, you start to care more about it, and then your grandparents are gone, so you won't get to talk to them about it. But I was able to tiptoe my way through war analogies for immunology, which I saw multiple here. And so obviously, I'm not a genius for coming up with this, but it's a way to connect to people. And so it made my family care more about what I was doing, why I had moved away, why I was in school for 1,000 years. And it allowed me to, sort of get the benefit and the gift of them asking questions from completely outside of the box. If you're presenting only to people who are in your same frame of mind, they're gonna ask questions that you already have heard before. But if your grandpa asks you something just completely outside of the box, it really has you, it gives you that gift to sort of reflect on what you know and what you think about your own project. And I also felt like I got to experience that whenever I was teaching in college at the collegiate level. So I was teaching immunology at John Carroll and CSU as a postdoc, and during my early stage of my career, because I wasn't really sure what I wanted to be when I grew up, and I thought maybe it was a professor. And so one of the things that I was able to do is figure out how to teach an extremely complex subject like immunology to people who had never thought about immunology. So it's like, how do you teach them the jargon? How do you teach them the interconnection between the cells? How do you teach them the concepts? And how do you continue to break it down into a way that's helpful, but not overly simplistic? And so a quote that I recently found, literally 4 or 5 days ago, but really was something that I embodied and learned during these stages of my life, is that if you can't explain it simply, it's because you don't understand it enough. And if you get caught by a question from somebody who is not experienced in this, it's because you don't know it well enough. So spend a lot of time right now, and I'm sure you guys have experienced this while you were prepping for this, is like, what are the nuts and bolts of my project? Why does my project matter? And if you've never been in front of people and gotten asked that question, you're lucky, and it'll come eventually, where someone will just ask you, like, who cares about myelin? And you're like, you have to sort of sit and go, why wouldn't you care about myelin? And you realize that not everybody's thinking about the same things you are the way that you're thinking about it. So I hope that your experience here and during this process gave you the types of insights that my experience talking with my family and teaching did, which is that understanding that you have to go deeper and deeper into your project in order to be able to communicate it effectively, particularly if you're trying to communicate it simply. And again, I thank you for inviting me here. I thank you for letting me experience and judge you guys, and for the bravery you guys have showed. And I hope you continue to utilize these same aspects of learning, which is that you go deeper and above in order to understand your project, and then you deploy them through the rest of your life as well. Learn more about your friends, ask more questions about your family members, and think about how the lessons that you learn from that will help you communicate with them better and build deeper and more significant relationships. Thanks so much. Oh, one thing, I do a lot of these with undergraduates and graduate students. So this is my actual personal email address. Case used to let you keep your emails. I don't know if they still let that, but that's still my email address, and you can reach out if you ever need anything or want to talk about Cleveland biotech scene.